Welcome to the podcast The Embodiment Talks, a podcast by the Embodiment LAB with Marjon van Opijnen. Taking your role as change agent of societal or education systems requires vision and courage. This podcast will help you take this pioneer's role with more body awareness and confidence, without losing sight of the connection with others. We dive into how we as humans are hardwired, how systems change works, and how both are related. I will take you on my own quest, and I will share background information, talk to experts, and share exercises. We will think, feel, and act. Great that you're here, and happy listening. Here we are. Sitting here for our interview for my English podcast.
I'm so excited and so honored that you asked me to interview you, Marjon. Thank you so much for including me in this, because I love talking to you about these topics, and we are famous for having like an hour-long conversation.
Yeah, we do.
At the drop of a hat about leadership and embodiment. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for taking the invitation. And I'm talking here to Amy Abdou, and she's been a colleague with me for many years already. So it's always been very nice to teach together, or indeed to meet and to have chats about all the nice innovative stuff that is out there.
Yeah, I think we're tuned in a particular way, you and I, as outsiders that are working within a structure, a system. And we both have our own way of kind of influencing those around us. So I saw you as an immediate ally and friend. And yeah, we've had a lovely friendship as well as being colleagues for 10 years. So
yeah, great.
So I wanted to start out talking about what drove you, or what led you to the path that you're on right now. And maybe to also think about some defining moments in which you said, well, you know what, now I can see clearly in which direction I need to go.
Okay, that's quite a big question. And so what defined me to go on this path? And if you talk about the key moments, I think one of the key moments, and I wasn't really aware of that at that time, was when I was 11 years old in 1984. When there was like the famine in the Horn of Africa, and I was looking at that as a kid, and I thought like, there's something weird going on here, and I already felt in my gut that, you know, you can't just feed those people and then think it's going to be fine again. But of course, I was only 11, and by then there wasn't much on, if nothing, on sustainability, or more to look at the underlying systems and dynamics that kind of cause these kind of things. At least maybe some people were aware of that, but there wasn't much work done on that. And I was too young as well to actually realize whether there was any work on it. But I had that gut feeling like there's something weird here. So I actually then decided that is going to be something I'm going to work on in my life, not knowing how. But very soon I thought I want to work for Médecins Sans Frontières, and that didn't happen immediately. It did happen, but only when I turned 27 or something. So it didn't just after my study. I didn't start working for them, and then in my study I thought I need to. I didn't want to do developing studies. I don't know why, but I just thought that's not what I have to do. I think that was very intuitive, that wasn't my path to go. But then I started studying business science, which of course is a completely different thing. And I wanted to combine that with social geography, because I thought like, okay, I can kind of combine where I intuitively probably felt that there was something to do with business, and if I combine that with more geography, demographics, and more the social part, and yeah, I was kind of curious to see what was coming out of that. I didn't have a clear picture myself, but I thought like, okay, that must lead to something. So I studied that, and then actually I got a regular job. But soon after that, I also realized, like, okay, just this regular job is not for me, and they're telling stories that are not right. So I kind of got in conflict with my conscience working there, and then I decided to move on.
Wow. I think the thing about the Horn of Africa, I was also about the same age, and I remember Live Aid.
Yeah.
And of course, so much of the focus was on the music and the concert, but underneath it, I had the same kind of unrest. And also being, I was very Catholic. I grew up in a very religious home. There was this real sense of duty that my mother, it just kind of always, brought us to soup kitchens and made us, deliver socks and, visit the elderly and all these things, which to me, it was like coming to a forefront then. Like there was a division amongst myself and my friends of what we were interested in Live Aid. Were we interested in just the story of the music and the concert and the good times, or were we interested in the underlying issues? So it's so nice to hear you say that was for you also a kind of a riveting moment.
Yeah. And still when I hear that song, Live Aid, I turn up the volume. And now especially like going towards Christmas, we're recording this in December 21. And now when I hear it on the radio, I'm really turning on the radio and I think like, and it still touches me because it always brings me back to this moment. And it somehow has brought me so much in my life and on my path. Yeah. And thank you for sharing that as well, because it kind of spreads light on what you're doing now, like with the kids here in the Belmer and so on. And because I didn't know this part of your story.
Yeah.
So
it's very Catholic.
Yeah.
I think the thing about being Catholic, well, I'm going to say that I'm not religious now. But what I maintained from that is the essence of faith is so powerful that when you believe that you can do something, you're really in it. And what I've tried to do now is lose some of the elements that I didn't work for me with religion and move that more towards a spiritual connection with my community and servicing my community, which I always feel gives me so much back. I think it's such an interesting thing about volunteer work when you have some perspective on it, that like you working for Doctors Without Borders, you don't do this for money or for your CV. And when you're in it, it requires faith.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, it really is a commitment or a commitment to something else than a career path. Although it did really serve me in my career as well. But that wasn't the primary goal.
And so much of the work you do now is about the aura that we present to the world. And I think that when you're in tune with your own belief structure and you're practicing your beliefs, then what you're giving out to the rest of the world is a sense of calm and maybe even hope. But maybe you have a different take on that.
I think that is what embodiment is about. So really to live your own beliefs, your own values, to live or to do and what you actually have to do in life. And that is not something that you can think about. It comes to you. And it doesn't knock on the door, but it comes to you by following what is right. And so when I look back at my own career, every time when my conscience came into play, that was a moment where I had to reflect on what I was actually doing. And it was a signal for me that there was something that wasn't right. And sometimes I could really pinpoint, like, oh, that is like when I quit my first job. It was about the stories that were told into the world and the practices that didn't meet the stories. And that is, I couldn't contribute to that. Fine that they do it, but I don't want to contribute. But I've also had points in my life where I thought, okay, I'm not sure what I'm doing here. Like I worked on sustainable supply chains for quite a few years after I came back from Médecins Sans Frontières. And at one point I started doing the Leaders for Economic Change program together with my colleague, Damaris Matthijssen. And that really gave words to something that I already felt like what I was just working on those supply chains and try to change them in the system that actually created them, the capitalist profit-making companies, then that the profit that they make with the projects is always key. And the sustainability is just something that they kind of use to make that profit. And I really struggled with that for quite some time until I started doing that project, and I got words for the feeling that I already had. And as soon to also come back to what you just said, as soon as I start feeling that there's something not right here, it's very hard to continue telling the same story.
Yeah.
So, because then I get into stories because I don't believe it anymore. And other people feel that I'm telling stories and it's not coming from the heart or from my own embodiment.
And how were you feeling in your body at that time? Do you remember?
Whoa, that's an interesting question. I don't know exactly whether I was so conscious about that. I mean, it's about nearly 10 years ago, 9 years ago. I wasn't sure whether I was so conscious about what was happening in me, but I do notice I start raising questions, and I think I start getting frustrated as well about what I'm doing, which I then tend to project maybe on the organization or the structures or the projects or things like that. But that already is a sign that there's something not right. As soon as I start projecting, and I think people listening to this as well, they probably recognize that as soon as that I or somebody else starts projecting something on the outside world, there's something happening in relation to that outside world that may not be right. And then to inquire into that and to feel into that, I mean, that is quite a skill.
Yeah, I think I have a similar experience in that I was working in a situation, I wasn't conscious that I was unhappy, but I came home and I would immediately pour myself a glass of wine, like every day. And then I realized I was looking forward to that glass of wine because I needed to just dull whatever was happening during the day. It was not sitting well. And that was also a sign for me, like, okay, I need to make a change.
Yeah. And then what did you do? Did you quit or?
Well, it's a kind of a long story. I tried to make it better and then I quit. Okay. I think that's the thing about being a kind of a change agent. And maybe you also can speak about this when your first intention towards an organization is to make it better, but when you realize what you're up against, it becomes overwhelming and you say, okay, well, I've done what I can do and now I have to leave because I'm not effective and I'm not a part of this team. I don't feel a part of the whole. I'm not feeling my values are respected. That was the bottom line for me. But
yeah, it's probably where I say that my conscience start having a voice and say, like, what am I doing? Is this how I want to contribute to the world? Is it right what I'm doing? Yeah. So I think I give it different words, but I think it's a similar process, like you say, like where my values are in play. Then I'd say, like, yeah, it's where my conscience starts to talk to me.
And so you made this choice to stop working in a particular industry or to make a shift, and then what happened?
I then became a consultant. I started my own company in the new economy, and I did some really great projects with my colleague, and soon I was already teaching at several schools, or mainly at Nijmegen, the New Business School by then, and that kind of grew, and that's where I then started teaching about leadership, transformative business, transformation processes, and parallel to that, I was walking my own personal development path, which was very much an embodied path, or about embodiment, about bringing in the body in whatever I do, and teaching new courses to create a world that is more intrinsically sustainable. Made me realize that I can't do that in the old-fashioned way. So there was one point where I had actually lobbied for that to be able to develop that course for 5 years, and then finally I was allowed to develop it. And then I was sitting there in front of my computer, and I went blank. I did not know what to do, and I thought, how am I going to put this in 14 classes of 2 hours? For 7 weeks. I can't. So I got to that point that I actually was going to give it back and say, like, I can't do this within this structure. And then that morning I woke up and I thought, I'm just going to make a proposal to do it completely different. And that's where, they allowed me to actually teach that course. And it was like 3 full days, and we had Innovision, and we did learning journeys to innovative entrepreneurs, and we harvested what they were all doing. And it was a really, really nice course. And so I think I tried to look for my own way within the structure, because of course, even if I design a course differently, I still have to meet certain requirements, like the number of hours, and there needs to be an assessment, and all these kind of things. So it's also, for me, it's like a choose your battles, because I do have my doubts, by the way, how we assess students. But at this point, I thought, okay, let's just see that I can design it in a different way so that the students actually really learn something, and have a fun time as well. Learning can be fun.
You brought all these practical elements into the course, as I remember.
Yeah, that was leadership for transformative business. That was still like 7 weeks, because there were 5 classes. It was very difficult to kind of put that in a different structure. But then I had the other course, which was paradigm shifts in business. And that was like, we really designed in a alternative way. Yeah. But also in leadership for transformative business, I also included very practical ways of learning. And because I can't talk about the system, but we need to experience it to really understand our own position in that system. And the funny thing I thought was as well that 5 lectures later, so they said, oh, that's what we did in that game as well. And I thought, like, oh, that's what learning is about, that you start making those links. But if I'm in front of a class just teaching them in theory, they never ever came back to me 5 lectures later saying, like, oh, that's what we did then. Where things actually fall in place. So I think different ways of teaching also serve the students in their learning process.
I'm so glad we ended up here, because I was listening to your previous podcast and there was this discussion about education, and it didn't go into assessment, but since we're talking about it now, I mean, what you're teaching is very difficult to assess in a way, the embodiment part of leadership, but not because you feel it intuitively. But as a teacher, I think a lot of times, the same question I think you asked yourself many years ago is, how do I teach it? And then how do I assess it?
Yeah, and now you want an answer.
Sorry, it's a hardball question.
Yeah, I think just to start with, I think there are some courses that can do with more regular assessment, although there may still be room for discussing that as well. But it's not the courses that I teach, and then I think about finance and these kind of courses. So it's not that the way we assess is all bad. I think we always need to. But the thing is, with this kind of assessment, what we do is we make it an assessment for every course. So it's like, okay, now we figured how we have to assess. So that's then how we're going to do it. And I would say it's the other way around. Okay, what do I want the students to get away with? What do I want them to learn? And how do I assess that? And that could be that they can, for example, write a reflection on their personal development. Or what I also sometimes did is that I asked students to make a blog or a vlog. So they could pick a topic that they really want to dive into. And they can share that with the group. So other students had to reflect again on the contributions of other students in their own creative way. And some students, or many students, really, really struggled. And they said, do we really not have to put the theory in there and literature and like a kind of an essay? No, if you want to make a poem, you make a poem. If you want to make a song, you make a song. Because if you really grasp what it is about and you can make a poem out of it, then you really know what it is about. You probably know better what it is about than when you write an essay.
Yeah.
Or they can make a vlog. So if you have difficulties writing, then you make a vlog and you talk. Mm-hmm. And they really enjoyed that. When they got over that first, like, what am I going to do? Yeah. Then they really enjoyed it.
So I think what you're teaching in a way is a way that students communicate. That it's about the way that they express themselves and how they represent themselves to the rest of the world. And you give them suddenly this freedom, and some of them probably grasp the opportunity, and others are like, I don't know what to do with this. And then how do you guide those students? You give them more options and...
Yeah, I would talk to them, and often they do things in their hobbies. And then I would say, like, okay, what if you would use that you do in your hobby in making this assignment? And I talk to them about what are topics that you're really concerned about or that you're really interested in. So I want them to have a topic for which they want to wake up at night. And I want them to find a way that really suits them.
Yeah.
And I may coach them a little bit on that when I give them that assignment.
That's lovely. So it's like leading them to their own source of power.
Yeah, their own source of power and their own source of creativity. Because I always say you go into the education system as a whole human and you come out as 1/3. And there's so many talents and parts of our embodied intelligence that we kind of do not pay any attention to in education. And that doesn't make us the humans that we actually need to be in this rapidly changing, very complex world.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And I think it's so interesting when you see students light up in those moments. It gives such a great reward. I actually was using Charmer. We've in the past used the work of Otto Charmer in a lecture or in a course that we co-taught. And I recently added it in a reading list for a class I'm teaching. And the student who had to prepare she prepares the presentation on this reading, she wrote to me and she was so moved by it, which struck me because she was saying it's so practical for everyday life. It's not just about academic anymore. There's something else that she started to contemplate after doing this reading about her own being, which I thought was really powerful. I love those moments when a student says, this meant something to me. Have you had moments, you've probably had many moments where like this, students come to you and say thank you?
Yeah, I do. And what I find funny as well, it really needs to sink in. And often when they start working, then they start realizing like, oh, that's what she was talking about. Also because they're so used to, especially at the business school, they get marketing and finance and accounting and law and entrepreneurship and somehow they know how to place that into their future career. And then you start talking about an emerging world, about systems, and goes much deeper into who they are personally, but also into the world. And then think like, but how am I going to use this? And so I've had students coming back to me and saying that it actually started making sense as soon as they started working.
Yeah. I guess, what would we say, when we started this conversation, before we started recording, I said, well, the job that you have now didn't exist when you started your journey. So now, looking back on this whole journey, what do you see in terms of your own power to self-actualize and to create something that didn't exist before when you were training?
I don't know. I think I've always been a little bit a stubborn person. And I think the most important thing is that don't get stuck. Don't believe that what you see is how it's always been and how it always will be. And that it's the only truth, and that it may be right now, but it may be not in a year from now or whatever. And do you have the guts and the strength to kind of follow as soon as it isn't right to you anymore? And I think that is what I've done in the past, and I still don't know what I will be doing in 5 years from now. I just know that now, in this moment of my life, part of what I have to do is to bring those two areas of expertise together, to bring the embodiment together with the societal systems change. And I don't know where the society stands in 5 years from now. On the embodiment side, there's a lot of development over the last decade, and we know more and more about it as well. So yeah, I really take it not by the day in that sense, but by the year maybe, or by the life period, and as long as it takes. Yeah.
I love what you just said. You don't know where it's going either. And I think that's true for all of us who are experimenting, trying to influence the systems that we work within, but also to think broadly about what are the relationships here. Like you said, with education, we actually teach people to contain themselves. And
we should teach them to contain themselves,
but
we don't.
Perhaps in the wrong way.
Yeah.
I was thinking more about the hierarchy in the classroom when you walk in. And of course, as a teacher, you always hope that your students are prepared, and you can sense from their reactions immediately whether they've done the reading, whether they feel good today. And this is also a little bit of a hardball question, but then I'm always wrestling with this need to be personable, and also to extend to them a little bit of kindness if they haven't prepared. And so there's that portion of me. Then there's the other hard academic that says, well, this is untenable. Everyone's come into the room and no one's done the reading. We're going to grab our books right now. There's that old school. And somewhere in between these two, we're still navigating. How do you navigate the space?
If ever a student listens to this podcast, they probably know that I can be quite bitchy as well. And but I think I've become more relaxed in that sense, and and for me it's also a challenge. How do I get them involved in their own learning? And if they don't want to learn, I also very easily okay, if you don't want to learn, then you don't learn. And it's also realizing that the courses that I give don't suit everybody. Like marketing doesn't suit everybody. Like, finance doesn't. So, and it's the same for my course. But, it's what I usually find is that students like it when it is a little bit different, and when they are challenged in a different way, and when they are involved in a different way, and when I make things visible, like what I said, oh, what we did then, that actually is falling into place here. And then students get interested, like, oh, wait a second, there is some relation here. And and sometimes I can be really harsh and say, like, okay, if you don't prepare, then I can't give this class, because it really needs preparation. Otherwise, indeed, we get into that old school teaching that I don't want to get into. It doesn't motivate me. It doesn't motivate you. So, it has happened once that I quit a class. It's like, okay, then you go and do your reading and I go home. Yeah. I bet they prepare the next class.
It's true.
And I also find, like, if students start preparing, they have much more fun in the course. It's that it's not. I find that a difficult part. Yeah.
It is, but it's. I think what you're saying also about, we recognize them as humans and we see them, and seeing them is very powerful too. Just to make eye contact with your students and ask, how are you today?
Yeah.
And sometimes you get a kind of a, yes ma'am, I'm fine, and sometimes they actually reveal, well, actually I have had a lot of trouble finding a house, and I've been kind of living on somebody's couch for a couple months, and then you think, wow, yeah, I do understand why maybe you're not prepared today, and it's just these moments when you have to tune in, and you're very good at tuning in.
Oh, thank you.
But that's why this is why you're able to go and do the things you do. That's your skill, your superpower.
Okay. Now I get a little bit shy.
Yeah. Yes, I know you hate when I praise you, but I was going to do it anyway, because what I wanted to bring back, something we talked about again before our conversation started, was that I was kind of new at all this, and you took me under your wing and helped guide me in the literature. At the same time, we were co-teaching, but you were also bringing me up to speed on so many of the things that you introduced me to. Donella Meadows, Otto Scharmer,
Margaret Wheatley.
Yeah, Margaret. Oh, I love Meg Wheatley. I still use so much of her work. It's so interesting to read it now post-COVID. Because it just doesn't age. We're always in crisis. Yeah. Maybe that's a new topic for us to kind of think about. What's your, looking back on the work that you've done, what's your assessment of where we are now?
In the world, I think the first thing that comes up in me, we're just starting. Because we more and more realize that the way how we've been trying to deal with those crises that we've had and still we're in the middle of a pandemic at the moment, doesn't work anymore, and we see that crises follow on to each other much faster than they did before, and there's more and more that realization that we really need to do things different, and so it's even more important now to better understand systems, the underlying dynamics, the undercurrent, and to also tune into the more relational part. Of how it's not that I have the truth, I have the solution, because we can't create isolated solutions that solve these problems. And any solution that one person will come up with is an isolated solution, because you only have one perspective on the whole. So we need to bring all those different perspectives together to actually come with an answer. And that is a hell of a job. Yeah. I mean, if you look at like governmental agencies or like global institutions trying to bring leaders together. And then, of course, we can debate a lot about our political leaders at the moment, where we're not going into. But it's definitely is a huge task that we're facing. And therefore, I think I think we're now at the point that we're starting to say like, okay, we need to do this different. And that is also going to hurt for some, and maybe for everybody, maybe for some not, I don't know. But and I think that especially young people don't take it anymore otherwise. And they want us, they really unconsciously or in the undercurrent call us to start making that change, or at least start with making change. So in a way, there's no way out to do it, like go back to the old school and continue doing that.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I notice a big difference between teaching. I do volunteer program with 10 to 12-year-olds, and I teach 19 to 25-year-olds, I suppose. The young people, the young pupils that I have are very eager to talk about climate change and the world and what they see around them and what they're it's on their minds, which I think is such a change from when I was a kid, where there were a few of us that were kind of tuned in, but the majority of my peers at that time were into makeup and, you know, other things, and it wasn't really, it created a kind of a splintering for me, where I went off away from the group because I was interested in this topic. So now I see that's becoming the norm.
Yeah. Yeah, and at the same time, they come from an old school educational system. So it also means that we start teaching them to become a whole person again. And that's a job of education, to make up for, you know, the one-sided way of we have educated them, because that's not going to serve us in the future. It's an important part, because it's good to have all those cognitive intelligences and so on, but there's more than that. And I think that is also something that a lot of young people are struggling with, because there's so many youngsters having burnout, anxiety, so much drug use. So there's so much happening in that generation, and of course that's always been like that. But if you really look at the statistics, it is different from before.
Agreed. Yeah, there's so much more information in play. Yeah,
and we constantly triggered by anything. We get so much information, and we're not hardwired for that. Although what I often hear those young people say is like, yeah, but I grew up with my mobile phone, so I can deal with it. But our nervous system can't, and they are over demanding their nervous system all the time. And as parents, we also feed that. You know, it's easy when we're cooking to give them a tablet. So we kind of give them those triggers all the time as well. And then if you go out, then it's busy and there's a lot of noise. And so it is really a challenge as well for young people to kind of step out of that system and say like, okay, today I'm not going to do anything, or I'm going to turn off my mobile phone, or because they are addicted. Yeah. So it's very, very difficult.
Agreed. I think that's our new challenge as teachers is we didn't grow up with mobile phones or the internet. And so we need to connect with this population of students who are in a very different frame of mind about technology and information and the sources that they receive, which I also feel, and maybe this sounds a little bit like an old lady talking, that when I was a kid, the news was just the news, and it was delivered in a very flat kind of way.
I mean, it was boring as well.
Right. It's a man of about 55 years old with a, you know, very down tan suit, a simple tie, and a full head of hair.
Yeah.
And now, you know, the way that we access information is much through social media.
Yeah, and it also has the so we're all stuck in that one community, like the people who think the same. So we kind of, although we have access to all the information, we have access to more information than any generation before us. But we don't use it. We only use those things that kind of come on our path, on our timeline, because the algorithms calculate which information kind of suits my way of thinking. So we've fed really in a one-way system, and there's no reason anymore to go out there and to do your own research, because it's all coming to you, which makes you lazy. And when you get everything is coming to you, it doesn't make you resilient to also be able to deal with information that is contradicting your view, for example. So we become much more narrow-minded, in a sense.
Yeah, I agree. There are these pillars of thought. You're in a column and there's no connection with the column next to you, which is the problem. But what I see in your career is that you are the person in between the columns, in the spaces in between our linear model. There you are.
Yeah, it's funny when I did my therapy education, so I haven't talked about my practice yet. I also have a practice where I work with clients on embodiment. But so when I did my therapist education, my teacher at one point said, like, you really the one who sees the polarities and who can kind of be the bridge between those. So that person said exactly what you say now as well, and I never saw it that way, but I think I can. Yeah,
I would love to talk to you about that in terms of the relationship to embodied leadership being the bridge, because for me that's what I've seen you do so many times in so many situations, is bridge kind of disparate communities and or disparate schools of thought, like marketing, management, financial stuff, and then there's this whole body about transformative business and leadership, and you make these connections.
Yeah, that's why also I started working at the NIRO New Business School, and I was teaching sustainability, and I said, like, how come we have a course on sustainability? Shouldn't that be part of all the individual courses? And so then I started a whole project to include that in all the different courses. So that's exactly what you say now as well, but that kind of hollowed the whole context of sustainability. So in the end I thought, like, that wasn't maybe the right thing to do. So how do I then so we should have independent courses on that as well, but at the same time it needs to be integrated. And
well, I think you were right on, because in a way, first of all, the New Business School suggested new business.
Yeah.
So they were already advertising that they were changing from the previous model. And I can remember very clearly in one class, one of the students asking me, well, what's wrong with old business? And I was, struck by it, because it was so innocent in a way that he posed that question. And I thought, yeah, he's got no context here. It struck me as a very valid question in a way, but there was also part of me kind of, screaming inside, like, well, there's pollution, there's this, labor issues that we have, the interconnections of our economies, where, you see some countries are really falling behind in this structure. So of course there has to be something new, but how do you communicate that difference between the new and the old to a student in a way when they're just being introduced to it, and maybe it's for them also a little bit of, not an attack, but they're not sure how they're going to process it in their bodies. So maybe I'll pose that to you as well.
I once did that exercise, so to bring in some of the embodiment that I do in the classes as well. And we're talking a lot about education, but in the end, I do a little bit more than that. I once had a student. We were in that beautiful, like that course that I talked about before, that I designed in a completely different way. We went off-site, so we went to other places where we taught those full days. And so we were in that beautiful building in the city center of Amsterdam, and they had a huge wooden table in the middle with those big lights and things, and those old paintings on the wall. And there I was with my class of students. And I asked them to embodied, to go and stand, to make living statues of of the different layers and positions in a company, to really feel on that. And at first, that guy, he actually went and stood on that huge wooden table, and he could actually touch those lights. and he was standing there and looking down onto the people. And onto the workers, because of course every layer was like representing a layer in the hierarchy in organizations. And I made him stand there and take that posture, and there was a lot of power in that. And then after a while he said like, okay, can I come down again? And I said, no. Really feel into what it is like to be in this position. And he got really uncomfortable. So at first it was like, yeah, I'm standing here, and it was all comfortable and great. But the longer he stood in that position, it really became uncomfortable. And that is probably a bigger learning for him than when I would tell that it wouldn't satisfy people or whatever, if he's just going to shout over them and tell them what to do. So about teaching the old and the new, first of all, I don't think there's a right and a wrong, because we don't really know what the new is. We also know that if the new is going to be really, really big, it will have side effects that we may not desire, although unintentional. And the same with the old. The old has brought us a lot, like the whole world and all the luxury that we currently have is because of the old way of doing business. And yes, a lot of things went wrong, which was like unintentional, and that we are dealing with now, but it also has brought us a lot. So I would rather say, like, can we take the good things and deal with the things that we do not desire? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And as you said earlier, we don't know where we're going, and yet here we are.
Yeah.
And I feel hopeful. As you said earlier, things are changing. Which, things that I didn't think would change in my lifetime are changing, which is so incredible to witness. So I think for us as, more mature educators looking back, that sense that I have that, my 20-year-old self was, filled with, anger and outrage and wanted to protest and do all these things. And somehow I want to send a message back to that person and say, it's going to be okay. You're going to be amazed at what changes, but also what you can do. You're so much more powerful than you think. At the moment that you feel powerless, if you could only have that insight. Do you feel that way looking back when you think of your younger self? Do you want to give yourself some wisdom?
Some wisdom for my some wisdom for my younger self. I wouldn't want to have lived another life than I actually did, although it hadn't always been easy, or at some points in my life I would have desired another life, but all in all I wouldn't have wanted to live another life than I actually did. But maybe a little bit more confidence and trust. Yeah. That everything will be all right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I do want to switch gears. I know we've been talking about education a lot, but to speak more about your practice and what you do with the people that you work one-on-one with.
Yeah, so I'm a trauma therapist, and I do a lot of breath work, and I work with deep fascia release as well. And so everything has to do with release of that is stuck in the body, which could be due to very severe experiences in earlier life, but could also be just by a repetition of certain behavior that is not so severe, but still has a huge impact on how we kind of pursue through life. And it's interesting having this talk, and as this podcast is about embodiment and societal systems change, I think we need to be able to release from the body to be more embodied, because there's so much information coming through the body, and if we want to take that on as a source of information, then we need to become more aware of our patterns and of our holding patterns in our body, so that it doesn't get, in between our intuition and feeling into the system and feeling into the change that we actually need. And our old patterns of fear or anger or whatever.
Yeah.
So I like to work on that with people to see how to kind of release those patterns from their body so that they can really take that true change agent or pioneering position. Yeah.
And so what is that process like? Do you interview your client?
That really depends. I really work in the moment. I try to use as little words as possible, which sometimes is very possible, sometimes is not, because we also need to relearn to tap into our embodied wisdom. So we need to relearn like the language of our bodies as well, which I'm actually going to make a podcast about as well, on how does the body speak, and so it really depends on how I work with clients. Sometimes on a table, sometimes I also make living statues to really feel in, like if we do something in life over and over again, if we really feel in it, it gives us information that we may not get from the mind. So yeah, no, that's really diverse. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it. I'm very intrigued because I was telling you earlier, I'm often having issues sleeping, and I'm doing this thing, I like to call it mind watching. Mm-hmm. You're trying to calm your mind, and yet the randomest things keep popping up, or you focus on something negative that happened during the day, and then you're like saying to yourself, no, I'm not doing this now. I'm calming my head down, but it's not working. Yeah. Is this a familiar scenario?
Oh, yes. However, I also believe that if we talk about embodiment, there is like that information that is going down from the mind to the body. And for example, that we are talking here and these kind of things, it's my mind, although I'm feeling into that as well, but it's that is talking, and it's a deliberate act that I'm sitting here and that we're doing this. But there's much more, and I think it's about 80% bottom-up information from the body to the mind, and then that means there's only 20% going from the mind to the body. So what I find interesting in embodiment as well is to start listening again to those to the information that is actually coming from the body. And often when we really tend to go into thoughts and so on, we often don't listen, or we're not focused on our bodies, and it's kind of coping mechanism to start thinking. And I know that as well, if I'm really, really busy. And like last night, actually, I'd been working on my podcast till quite late. So I go to bed, and of course I can't fall asleep. And of course I'm really like waking up many times during the night. And it's just simply because I didn't take care of myself. And I'm still in that whole processing and thinking a lot. And I didn't listen to the signals of my body. So, yeah.
Well, it's nice to hear that even practitioners have these moments.
Oh, yes, of course.
And I'm really intrigued by the idea that our bodies, the majority of the information is coming from the body to the brain.
Yeah, I often give this example. So just imagine you're in the tropics and you enter a room where there's snakes, and you enter a room and you see that kind of snake on the floor. And so the first thing, you walk in, and the first thing that happens, if you are in shock and you think, oh, a snake, and then you really look. So that's the instant reaction from your body. And that is what happens all the time, also with all the information that comes in. And the body is just instantly reacting to everything. And then you look a little bit better and you think, oh, it's a water hose. There's no snake.
Yeah.
But at first you're like, so that's how fast the body actually reacts. And it reacts much faster than that the mind does. Yeah. So the mind always walks kind of behind of what actually is happening.
It's so intriguing. There's a story in my family about my great-grandmother having killed a poisonous snake when she was 7 years old. And so it was this wonderful moment in the end, because of course it could have gone really tragically the other way. And I always said to my father, well, you know, we wouldn't have been here then, you know, imagine that scenario. But because she was 7 years old, I think she didn't know. She just thought, oh, it's a snake, I gotta kill it. You know, she never sensed the danger because she wasn't taught to think about it that way. So I'd like to think of it as a great act of bravery, but I think it was just guile. I think she was just like, meh, snake, cut its head off. But they were very, you know, in awe of this action. So maybe we need to reconnect with our younger selves in this guileless way of being maybe fearless.
Yeah, although fear has a function as well. So in this case with a snake, or if I face a tiger or something, I better be really scared and run off. So fear does have a function. But in our current societies, there's not so much reason for fear, and yet we do have a huge number of people suffering from anxiety, so which is interesting. But what I like in what you say is to reconnect to that playfulness and curiosity. So there's that kid that doesn't have words for something, and it just, if it looks at a tree, it just sees something and it makes a noise, and there's some things blowing in the wind and it's moving, and it can just look at it with that awe to something very small, and to relearn that again. That is a huge quality, because it would give us a completely different view on the world if we could look at something with that awe of a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old little kid.
Yeah, I have a 11-year-old son, and he's also very worried about the future and climate change. And whenever he saw a smokestack, he'd get very upset and he'd start raging. And I would try to say, well, you know, let's, you know, try to temper our feelings and emotions here. We can't just shut everything down at once. And he would say, why not?
Yeah, that innocent, like, okay, but you know, if let's just try, and you know, it's like, see what happens. And we as adults are so scared of trying just to shut everything down. Although we did kind of with Corona, we shut everything, but that was in a different way, and so it didn't really allow us to see what would actually emerge. And I'm not sure whether I would promote that experiment, but at the same time I was curious as well. What would actually emerge if it would entirely collapse? And hope we won't end up in a war. But
I thought, you know, he's right in a way, because he still has the capacity to ask the questions we're afraid to, or to say, well, what is that really true?
Yeah.
You know, if all the planes had to, you know, suddenly, you know, they had to do half the number of trips they were doing, and which that happened, as you said, you know.
Yeah.
He actually got there. I love the trajectory, but I want to bring it back to your work. And just, you know, because for my edification, when I think about the way in which my body exhibits stress, you know, to me, I feel it in my nervous system. But how else do people experience that in their bodies? How do they, when they're disembodied, how do you identify it? And then how do you help them become more in touch?
Yeah. That's quite a big question. Podcast number 5 is going to be about all those physical sensations and what we can all feel and experience in our bodies. And I really work in the moment with people, and it really depends on the person that I'm working with in that moment to say, like, okay, then this happens and that happens. One person is more resilient than the other person, for example. So if somebody is very little resilient and very little grounded, you know, it's important to get grounded and to get into their bodies. If somebody is already very embodied, then, you know, I can use that wisdom that the person can already be in touch with to kind of make steps. And what I also find, if I take it, for example, to groups that are less experienced with embodiment, it always takes that kind of balance between the information, like why do we do the things that we do, and make it experiential. And so any, for example, visualization that we do, we can feel that in our body. So if I think about a moment that I really, really enjoyed during a holiday, something happens in my body. I feel the physical sensations of that moment when I think about that. And it's maybe a nice experiment to do just now in a moment as a small exercise. So just think about, a moment that, you were in awe about the scenery, or you had a really nice conversation with a local, or just could be anything. And then notice what happens in your body.
Well, I notice myself smiling.
Yeah, so there's something happening in your mood as well. Mm-hmm. So there's a smile on your face.
Yeah.
And there's those layers, like there is those physical sensations, and there's our mood and our emotions and our feelings, and we may even get some thoughts as well, like, oh, that was just such a sweet person I spoke to. And then how we feel completely changes.
Right. And I could also see the reverse happening when you focus in on the negative moment that happened during the day, or maybe somebody you had a conflict with in the past, and probably the exact same, right? Yeah.
But I always start and end with a nice, so that, people are regulated in something, that they don't come out like, I'm still really frustrated. But then if you think back of that holiday picture, then, yeah.
That's a nice tip. I'm going to take that forward. I actually forgot that you start your podcast with a pearl of the week.
Yeah, we didn't do that, but we can end with the pearl of the week.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, what was your pearl?
So I was telling you about my experience doing the reading program, and how I immediately feel gratified in the presence of these kids, because they're so open and curious. They're there, they're volunteering their time as well. And so for me, it's like I feel respected, honored, valued, loved in a way in this. It's such an inviting atmosphere to be with kids who are motivated, passionate, young. And so I'm thinking about that warm feeling I got on Friday.
It's really touching you now in a moment, isn't it? I can see that,
because I'm also kind of, a preacher, an evangelist of sorts. I like to convince everybody to get involved in my projects. And I noticed that when I can connect to this feeling, and I'm talking about it, like you say, you see it in my face, you see it in my body language. So for me, this has been an important idea to connect my enthusiasm for what I'm doing and the feeling that I get with bringing other people in and watching them experience it as well. Which has kind of also been for me a kind of like a moment of like, oh, strategic. This could be an interesting way to involve students in this kind of work. That's the challenge I've set for me. So that was my pearl of the week.
Okay.
And you?
Good. My pearl of the week. I received an email yesterday, because I'm gonna make a Dutch and a English podcast, because I couldn't choose, and I find listening in the car like to a Dutch podcast is just really relaxing, and but then my network there's many English people, and I did a lot of international education, so I thought, okay, I'll just do it both. So my Dutch interview is already online, and somebody wrote me an email how it had touched him. I received it yesterday, and I don't want to go into too much detail because I don't think it's fair to him to really elaborate on that. But how it kind of clarified things on how also to bring innovative ideas into the world and the difficulties, and how also the pioneer's kind of struggle. And there were two things that really struck me with the email. Is first of all, it was a really, really long email. And I thought like, wow, that somebody makes such an effort to write this to me. And that was just really touching. And the other thing is that, we already spoke a little bit about your Catholic background, and he's Christian. And although I'm as well from my background, but I don't do much with that anymore, because I kind of have difficulties with the institutionalization of religion. But he really spoke about religion in the context of societal change and what religion brought to him into that, but completely independent from the institutionalization of it. And it also shows like the power. And then I see it more as like a spiritual thing than it is like a religion. Then it comes really close, like spirituality and religion. And his reflections were really touching me. And it also challenged me to look at his view with a completely different perspective than I would usually do. So he kind of opened my eyes in what also people get from being Christian, which is completely different from the institutionalization. So that was really a beautiful email that I received. I still have to answer. Yeah.
That's so nice. I love that story. And also because you introduced this topic of spirituality, which I did want to introduce, but and maybe...
Yeah, we're already very long into...
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I really like this conversation.
Something that I think we're all wrestling with is the absence of the spiritual in light of I've also not been a practicing Catholic. I don't believe actually in God per se. But I feel, because it was so much a part of my life when I was younger, that there was a hole, there was something missing in it, and I filled it with, feminism and socialism and other things, and that gave me a little bit of direction. And now, what I have is sort of a mishmash of all these ideas. But how do you go forward with spirituality?
I find spirituality a very difficult word. I would say, what is it? Because there's so much judgmental connotation with the word spirituality. And I kind of, and that may be very spiritual or not, but I try to live my life in with what is right in the moment, and to be able to tune into myself, but also to be able to tune into my environment, into my relations, and into the larger whole. So, and I think if I'm able to match those different parts, like tuning in with myself, tuning in with the other, and tuning in with the world, then and do the thing that I'm meant to do in that context, I think that is a very spiritual practice. And of course I do meditation, and I do my own practices and these kind of things. But I think this actually, being able to match this together, I think that for me is my spiritual practice.
That's really beautiful. That's definitely a way forward, and I appreciate you being so candid about it.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much for letting me interview you. I'm also a big fan. So
thank you for doing this and spending your time on this. It was a really nice conversation.
Definitely. To be continued.
Definitely. Okay. Great that you listened to this episode of the Embodiment Talks. Please let me know your thoughts about this episode or the insights that you gained. Email me to the address in the show notes. If you want to get in touch with me, or if you have a question or topic that you want to know more about, don't hesitate to send me an email as well. Do you want to be kept up to date? Like this podcast in your favorite podcast app. You can help me by giving a thumbs up or leaving a comment so that this podcast will reach more people. You can find more information about my work on my website www.embodimentlab.nl or my YouTube channel Embodiment Lab. Thanks for listening and meet you at the next episode.